Hello, everybody, and welcome to History Bite number 97, dated October 29th, 2020. I'm Walter, your mobile historian and blue-collar scholar. This History Bite is entitled The Union Occupation of Baltimore and Maryland During the American Civil War. If you have not watched History Bite number 96 on the Baltimore riot of 1861, it is highly advised that you watch that one first to be able to put everything into this History Bite in its full context, okay? If you have already watched 96, awesome. Continue to listen. Now, the Union occupation of Baltimore and the state of Maryland as a whole, okay, was in part largely due to the result of the Baltimore riot of 1861, which we discussed in number 96, okay? That riot, for sure, proved the suspicions of many that the state of Maryland and its primary port city, Baltimore, were very much in question during the American Civil War, okay? And as a result of that, it became necessary to ensure that Maryland did not secede from the Union, okay? As Virginia had already left, and if Maryland seceded, then the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., would be surrounded by Confederate territory. This was something that could not happen. So, after the Baltimore riot of 1861, Union troops continued to flow down the American coast to Washington, D.C. General Benjamin Butler, who was in command of the 8th Massachusetts Regiment, okay, after hearing of the terrible events in Baltimore, on April 19, 1861, left Philadelphia the following day en route to Washington, D.C., but instead of traversing through Baltimore, he instead took ferry boats and landed at Annapolis to continue the journey to Washington, D.C. Once he arrived in Annapolis with his troops, he imposed strict order. He obtained the necessary provisions for his troops, threatened to arrest any members of the Maryland state legislature who dared vote for secession, and took in his personal possession the Great Seal of Maryland. All right, he put the city under a tight, very firm hand, and ordered the restoration of the railroad, Annapolis Junction, between Annapolis and Washington, D.C., okay? That was completed by the 27th of April, all right? And the troops were able to successfully continue their journey from Annapolis to Washington, D.C. without issue or incident, okay? General Winfield Scott, okay, the primary commander of the U.S. Army at the time, certainly praised Butler for his actions. And not long thereafter, he ordered Butler to essentially secure virtually all of the state of Maryland and its essential channels of commerce, okay, going south, all right? He ordered Butler to make sure that no goods or anything else were to pass through the Baltimore area, through Annapolis, or anything else going south towards the Confederacy, okay? This was a mammoth-sized task, and essentially Butler was to set up his encampments around the area known as Relay, not far south of Baltimore, to prevent these goods from going from Baltimore to the south, okay? Anything going in that direction would have to be scrutinized big time and stopped, seized if necessary, all right? Because anything going south was likely going to the Confederacy. That we couldn't have. But instead of occupying Relay and, obstructing any commercial items going south, Butler decided to occupy Baltimore itself. This ran directly in contrary to the orders given to him by General Winfield Scott. But that did not matter to Beast Butler. All right. So on the 13th of May, 1861, Butler arrived secretly in Baltimore by train in the night, in the midst of a powerful thunderstorm with about 1,000 troops, okay? So he easily got in the city under the cover of darkness and set up a huge encampment atop a Federal Hill at the Inner Harbor, okay? With that encampment, Butler surrounded the top of the hill with about 70 cannons and raised a huge American flag, okay? Fort Federal Hill was essentially the base of the Union Army that initially would occupy Baltimore. All right, this was the initial occupation of Baltimore, Maryland. Okay. So when the people of Baltimore woke up the next day, they literally found themselves under the gun. Okay. Baltimore, like I said, could not be trusted, and essentially neither could the government of the state of Maryland. All right. So Butler's action had two purposes. First, to quell the very large amount of pro-Confederate sympathy in the city, and number two, to significantly deter the state of Maryland from even thinking about seceding from the Union, if they even tried. Okay? The Union forces atop a Federal Hill would blow Baltimore to rubble. And believe me, there were a lot of cannons up there that would have taken care of that very easily. Okay? So, upon hearing of Butler's action, General Winfield Scott was very, very, very angry at Butler, all right, as he had acted without orders. Despite Butler's success, Butler didn't encounter any resistance whatsoever in doing this, okay? So not long thereafter, though, even though Butler was successful with this encampment and occupation, Scott transferred Butler down to Fort Monroe in Virginia, okay? Butler was replaced by General Nathaniel Banks, okay? And during the time in which Baltimore was occupied by the Union Army during the American Civil War, the city would be very tightly governed by no less than 8 specific military commanders, each with varying levels of harshness towards Confederate sympathizers in the city, okay? During the military occupation of Baltimore, it became unlawful for citizens to print any type of pro-Confederate papers or publications. All arms were seized. There was to be no private possession of any guns whatsoever, okay? And even potential words which suggested one was sympathetic to the Confederacy could result in one's arrest. Indeed, thousands of Baltimoreans were arrested, jailed indefinitely, some at Fort McHenry during the occupation of Baltimore. And indeed, when the Union government took control militarily of Annapolis, it didn't militarily govern the state per se, but when the Union Army occupied Annapolis, several members of the Maryland State Legislature, as well as several politicians in Baltimore, were arrested and detained quite some time on suspicions of disloyalty to the United States. President Lincoln was not playing with these people. Even suspected disloyalty could land one in prison at Fort McHenry and in other places indefinitely. All right. Constitution and Bill of Rights be set aside for the moment. All right. And this was the norm, okay, until it was assured, essentially, by way of heavily occupying Maryland with Union troops, that Maryland would not secede from the Union, okay? And over time, like I said, with respect to the occupation of Baltimore, each of its commanders of the Union troops there varied in their level of severity, all right? And during the time of the Union occupation of Baltimore, there were no less than 15 military installations constructed in and around the city to protect it from Confederate attacks, as well as to ensure local order. All right. And this worked, folks. By the time the American Civil War ended, Baltimore was certainly no longer the bastion of Confederate sympathy that it had been in 1861. Indeed, the Union commanders had all but wiped that out by detaining and deporting thousands of people who had such sympathies, all right? And so many pro-Union people had moved to Baltimore that, by war's end, it was certainly a much more pro-Union place. And this is interesting, as I'm a Baltimorean and, I understand and know this history very well. And, we were one of the few locales during the American Civil War that never seceded from the Union, of course. I mean, talking about the state of Maryland in general. Maryland was one of the Maryland was one of the border states during the American Civil War, of course. And we were always in the Union, even though that was not a guarantee. Like I said, I never take that for granted. All right. And we were occupied for the entire war by hundreds of thousands of Union troops as an insurance policy to guarantee that we would not leave the Union. OK, so we were one of the few always, loyal parts of the Union, though a border state nonetheless, that was occupied for the entire conflict, without any backing off of that. And like I said, that's because we surrounded the nation's capital. Maryland could not leave the Union. And of course, the occupation of Baltimore and essentially the state of Maryland ended roughly between April and June of 1865 with the Confederate surrender and the resumption of business as usual. But for sure, it left a legacy upon the city and the state in general. So the occupation of Baltimore was not a pleasant one, and certainly left a bitter taste in the mouths of many citizens. But what had to be done had to be done. All right. And it protected the city and the state. All right. And ensured the loyalty of both to the United States throughout the war. All right. So I think that pretty much covers the basics of it all. Any questions or controversies, leave them down below and I'll be happy to answer them. All right. If you have not subscribed to my channel, I humbly ask that you do so. Thank you so much for listening to this History Bite, and I will talk to you at the next one. Take care and stay safe out there.